Stop trying to be romantic. It's embarrassing." Those words hit me like a slap that didn't leave a mark, just a sting that kept spreading. My husband said it on our 5th wedding anniversary, right after I handed him a leather-bound photo album I'd spent 3 months making. Not ordering it online, not clicking a template, I mean cutting, pasting, handwriting little captions in the margins, hunting down old prints, choosing a cover I thought felt like us. I stood in our kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, wearing the red dress I knew he used to love. The candles were already lit on the table behind me, their little flames trembling like they could sense what was coming. The roast I'd worked on all afternoon sat warm and perfect in the oven, and Nathan just flipped through our memories like he was sorting mail he didn't ask for. "My name is Lena, and I'm 31 years old. I've been married for 6 years to a man who taught me, slowly and patiently, that loving him out loud was a problem I needed to fix. I'm a senior accountant at a manufacturing company downtown, the kind of job where you learn to keep your emotions in a tight box and label everything clearly. Precision. Neutral tone. No drama. At work, I'm good at that. At home, I used to be the opposite. I was the woman who remembered birthdays and inside jokes, who planned little weekend surprises, who tucked notes into lunch bags, who sent good morning texts even when we'd slept in the same bed. That night, when Nathan's face twisted into annoyance mixed with something like pity, I did what I'd trained myself to do. I smiled. Not a real smile, the kind you wear when you're trying to keep the peace. I told him I understood. I apologized for making him uncomfortable. Then I cleared the table, blew out the candles, and slid that photo album into the back of the closet, where it still sits like a sealed time capsule from the last version of me that believed effort could change everything. But something shifted. Not in a movie way. No screaming, no shattered glass, no dramatic storming out. It was quieter. It felt like the soft click of a lock turning somewhere inside my chest. Like a door that had been held open for years finally closing. Not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. The next morning, I woke up before him like I always did. I moved through the bedroom in the dim early light, quiet out of habit, careful not to disturb him. Usually, I would make his coffee, set out his vitamins, iron his shirt if it needed it. I knew his routines better than he did. Instead, I got dressed, grabbed my bag, and left for work. When he texted me later asking if I'd forgotten his lunch, I typed back that I'd been running late. It was a small lie, but it felt huge. I hadn't lied to Nathan before, not even about little things. I'd always believed honesty was part of love. But that morning, the lie wasn't about hiding something, it was about taking something back. One tiny inch of myself. That was the first crack. Over the next few weeks, I started watching myself like I was someone I'd been assigned to audit. I studied my habits. I tracked my reactions. I noticed how often I anticipated Nathan's needs before he said a word. How often I apologized when I wasn't wrong. How often I tried to earn warmth by being convenient. And then the harder realization hit me. I had been performing love. Not because I didn't feel it, I did. I felt it deeply. I felt it so deeply that I turned it into a job, a constant project with deadlines and deliverables, because somewhere along the way I convinced myself that if I loved hard enough, he would eventually meet me there. I was waiting for a return on an investment he never asked me to make. And if I'm honest, he made that clear more times than I wanted to admit. There was the time I surprised him with concert tickets for his favorite band and he complained that I should have checked his schedule. There was the cabin weekend in Hocking Hills, which I planned down to the last detail, and he spent half the trip on the phone talking to his brother about fantasy football. There was the birthday party I organized with his friends, where he pulled me aside like I was a child who'd embarrassed him and told me I was trying too hard, that it made people uncomfortable. Each memory surfaced like a bruise. Not the kind you notice right away, but the kind you forget until you press on it, and then you realize it never fully healed. My best friend, Colleen, noticed before Nathan did. Colleen and I have been close since college, the kind of friendship where you can hear the truth in someone's silence. We were having lunch one afternoon, and she looked at me over her iced coffee and asked if I was okay. I said I was tired. She didn't believe me, but she didn't push. That's one of the reasons I love her. She gives you space, but she never lets you pretend you're fine forever. Nathan, though, didn't notice anything at first. That part hurt more than I expected. I'd spent years trying to make him feel special. And when I stopped, it wasn't like he turned and said, "Hey, where did you go?" It was like nothing changed in his world. The absence of my affection was invisible to him because he never valued its presence. He still expected dinner. Clean counters. Ironed shirts. He still expected me to listen to his coworker complaints, to nod at the right moments, to ask questions that kept him talking. But he didn't notice that I stopped reaching for his hand. He didn't notice I stopped saying I love you first. And that's when the question started creeping in, quiet and cruel. How long would it take him to notice me disappearing? Part of me hoped he'd ask. I hate admitting that, but it's true. A part of me still wanted him to turn toward me one night and say he missed the way I used to look at him, like he mattered. Weeks passed. Then a month. Then 2. And the colder truth formed in the spaces between our conversations. He walked through our house like someone sleepwalking through his own life, not cruel, not loud, just absent in a way that slowly drains the color from everything. I started keeping a journal. Not because I'm poetic, but because I needed somewhere to put the thoughts that were piling up in my chest. One night I wrote a sentence that scared me with how clean it was. I wonder if he ever loved me, or if he just loved what I did for him. That question followed me everywhere. Into meetings at work. Into grocery store aisles. Into the quiet moments when I stood at the sink washing dishes I didn't even want to cook. When I looked back, I could chart our marriage like a slow decline, the kind you don't notice day to day because it's not a crash, it's erosion. In the beginning, it felt easy. Nathan was charming when we met at a friend's barbecue. He had this effortless confidence, the kind that makes people lean in. He laughed at my jokes. He asked me questions that made me feel interesting. I fell quickly, and when he proposed 2 years later, I said yes without hesitation, like love was a door you just walk through when it opens. Our wedding was small and beautiful, in a garden outside the city, friends and family close enough to feel like a circle. My mother cried when she saw me. Nathan's dad toasted us and said I was the best thing that ever happened to his son. I believed him. I believed our love was special. Rare. Unbreakable. And then, almost immediately after the honeymoon, the cracks started. Nathan wasn't cruel in the obvious ways people warn you about. He didn't scream. He didn't throw things. He didn't call me names in public. His neglect was quieter. It came as forgotten anniversaries, cancelled plans, eyes drifting to his phone when I was talking. It came in the way he made me feel like my desire for closeness was an inconvenience, like I was asking him to do something exhausting by simply wanting him to be present. So I compensated the way I always did. I tried harder. And I didn't realize that every time I tried harder, I was teaching him the same lesson, that he didn't have to show up, because I would carry both of us. At first, I told myself it was normal. I told myself every relationship settles, that the first spark always cools, that real love is quieter, more practical. I repeated those ideas like they were wisdom, even when they were really just excuses I used to explain why I felt lonely sitting 3 feet away from my own husband. So I did what I always did when something felt unstable, I tried to stabilize it with effort. I signed us up for a cooking class, because I thought if we had a shared activity, he would look at me again. I planned date nights at restaurants he mentioned once in passing, like the fact that I remembered would translate into the fact that he cared. I bought lingerie I felt ridiculous in, standing in the mirror afterward with the tag still on, trying to convince myself that wanting to be desired wasn't needy, it was human. Nathan's reaction to all of it was never angry, not at first. It was worse than angry. It was lukewarm. Polite. Like he was humoring me. Like I was a child showing him a drawing, and he was saying nice without looking up from his phone. And when he did react, when the lukewarmness shifted into dismissal, it always landed in the same place. You're trying too hard. Why are you making this a thing? Can we just relax? His version of relax meant I should stop asking for anything that required him to feel something. I didn't have the language for it back then, but now I do. He wasn't comfortable with emotional intimacy, and instead of owning that, he framed my needs like they were a flaw. Like I was the one creating pressure. Like I was the one who didn't understand how marriage worked. My sister, Brenda, saw it before I did. Brenda never liked Nathan, but she wasn't dramatic about it. She didn't pick fights or throw insults. She just watched him with a calm, suspicious patience, like someone who's seen this kind of man before and knows how it ends. One Thanksgiving, after Nathan spent the entire dinner talking about himself without asking anyone else a single question, Brenda followed me into the kitchen and asked quietly, "Are you actually happy?" I laughed, too fast. Of course. It came out like a reflex. Like I had practiced it. But Brenda didn't smile back. She just looked at me the way you look at someone you love when you can see them lying to themselves. I said it again, softer, like repeating it might make it true. I'm happy. It was easier than saying, I don't know how to fix this. Because I had already built my identity around being the one who fixes things. That was the pattern. I didn't just love Nathan, I managed Nathan. I managed our home, our schedule, his moods, his comfort. I managed the temperature of the room, and I was so good at it that he didn't even realize a temperature was being maintained. Our marriage became a performance. I played the role of the loving wife, the patient wife, the wife who didn't ask for too much. Nathan played the role of a man who allowed himself to be loved. And the imbalance was always there, humming beneath the surface like a refrigerator you stop hearing because it's been running so long. I gave and gave and gave. He took and took and took. And neither of us named the transaction happening underneath it all. I convinced myself this was what long relationships looked like. That passion fades. That romance becomes responsibility. That stability matters more than tenderness. So I stayed stable. I stayed committed. I stayed devoted. I stayed long after devotion started to feel like self-erasure. The irony is Nathan probably believed our marriage was fine. Why wouldn't he? He never complained. He never asked for more. From his point of view, everything worked. He had a wife who kept the house running, remembered his preferences, made his life smooth, and didn't demand anything he didn't want to give. Why would he question a setup that benefited him every single day? But it wasn't working for me. I started feeling invisible in my own home. Not in a dramatic way, not like I was being ignored in an argument, more like I was becoming part of the background. Like I was furniture. Useful. Familiar. Easy to overlook. There were nights we'd sit across from each other at dinner, and I'd realize I didn't know what he was thinking. I didn't know what he dreamed about, what scared him, what he wanted from life. And I tried. I really tried. I would ask, "What are you excited about lately?" He'd shrug. "Work's fine." I'd ask, "Do you ever think about moving someday? Starting something new?" He'd say, "Why would we do that?" I'd ask, "What do you want our life to look like in 5 years?" And he'd laugh like I was asking him to write a poem. "We're fine, Lena. Why are you overthinking everything?" His answers were always vague, always evasive, always designed to end the conversation before it started. It was like intimacy was a language he'd never learned, and instead of admitting he didn't speak it, he acted like it was a useless language anyway. And the worst part was how much I adjusted. At work, I was respected. Trusted. Measurable. If I did a good job, I could see the results. My colleagues valued my input. My boss gave clear feedback. There was logic to it. A structure. At home, I lived in guesswork. I guessed what mood Nathan would be in when he walked through the door. I guessed whether my excitement about something would annoy him. I guessed how much affection was acceptable before I crossed into the territory he called embarrassing. I learned how to shrink my joy into something smaller, quieter, easier to tolerate. And I didn't even realize I was doing it until that anniversary night. Because that night, he didn't just dismiss a photo album. He dismissed the part of me that still believed in showing love. He called it embarrassing. He made me feel like my tenderness was something to be ashamed of. And once you feel ashamed of the way you love, you don't just bounce back from that. You don't just communicate better and move on. Shame changes how you breathe. It changes how you stand in your own skin. So after that night, I didn't make a dramatic plan. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't threaten divorce. I did something quieter. I stopped. I stopped planning. I stopped hoping. I stopped trying to be the wife I thought he wanted. And then I waited, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I needed to know something. If I removed the variable of my effort, what would remain? At first, what remained was comfort, for him. I watched it happen. The first couple weeks after my shift, Nathan seemed almost lighter. Like my constant warmth, my constant invitations, my constant attempts to connect had been a pressure on him he never talked about. Without it, he could come home and disappear into the basement with his video games without having to pretend he felt guilty. He could scroll through his phone at dinner without seeing my eyes trying to pull him back into the room. He looked relieved. And that did something to me. It confirmed that my love, my presence, my effort, wasn't a gift to him. It was a demand in his mind. Something he had to tolerate. Something that asked him to engage, to reciprocate, to be emotionally awake. When I stopped asking, he got to sleepwalk again. But then, slowly, the relief started to shift. He began coming upstairs more often. Not to talk, not directly, but to hover. He'd linger in the kitchen while I cooked, then walk away. He'd stand in the doorway while I read, like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. He started to sense the absence without understanding what it was. And I watched him struggle with it, and the irony almost made me laugh, except it wasn't funny. He had spent years avoiding my attention, and now that it was gone, he didn't know how to exist inside the space it left behind. One evening, about 6 weeks after the anniversary, he finally asked, "Are you okay?" I looked at him and said, "I'm fine." He pressed a little. "You've been quiet." I shrugged. "Just tired." He stood there in the living room, staring at me like I was a puzzle he couldn't solve. And for a split second, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered all the times I tried to talk to him, and he didn't even look up. All the times I tried to tell him I was lonely, and he acted like I was accusing him of a crime. My silence wasn't revenge. It was protection. Because if I kept pouring, I was going to run dry. And I was starting to realize something I didn't want to admit. Without me propping it up, our marriage didn't have a heartbeat. It just had routines. I didn't wake up one day suddenly strong. It was slower than that. It was more like I stopped bleeding out in small, invisible ways. The kind of wounds no one notices because you keep showing up anyway. The house changed once I stopped trying. Not physically, at first. The furniture stayed the same. The walls didn't move. But the feeling in the rooms shifted, like the air had been slowly let out without anyone hearing the hiss. I stopped lighting candles at dinner. I stopped putting fresh flowers on the table. I stopped asking about his day before he asked about mine, which meant most nights we ate in silence because he never thought to ask at all. I didn't announce these changes. I didn't explain them. I just let them happen. Nathan noticed in fragments. He noticed the quiet. He noticed the absence of warmth without understanding what warmth actually was. At first, he mistook the silence for peace. For ease. For the relief of not being asked to participate emotionally. But silence isn't neutral when it replaces connection. It becomes loud in its own way. I started keeping my journal closer. Not to dramatize what was happening, but to anchor myself in reality. To remind myself I wasn't imagining this. One night I wrote, I feel like a ghost in my own marriage. Not because I'm ignored, but because I've made myself invisible to survive. That sentence scared me. Because it meant I knew. And once you know, you can't unknow it. Colleen finally caught me one Saturday morning at a coffee shop near her apartment. She took one look at my face and said, "Okay, you don't get to say you're fine today." So I told her everything. I told her about the anniversary. About the album. About the word embarrassing. About how I stopped trying and how Nathan didn't notice at first. About how I felt like I'd been holding up a building alone and finally stepped away to see if it would stand. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush me. She just listened, her hands wrapped around her mug like she was grounding herself to stay present. When I finished, she asked a question so simple it took my breath away. "What do you want, Lena?" Not what do you want him to do. Not what do you think you should want. What do you want? I stared at the table, my throat tight, realizing I hadn't asked myself that in years. My wants had been folded into Nathan's comfort so completely I wasn't sure where mine even lived anymore. "I want to feel like myself again," I said finally. "I want to feel like I matter without having to earn it. I want to stop apologizing for having emotions." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I've watched you disappear," she said softly. "And I hated it." That broke something open in me. Because when someone names what you've been hiding from yourself, there's no going back. That night, Nathan tried to touch me in bed for the first time in months. Not tenderly. Not curiously. Just familiar, like muscle memory kicking in. I turned away and said I was tired. He didn't push. But I could feel his confusion in the dark, thick and unsettled. He was starting to sense that something fundamental had changed, that the rules he never knew existed were suddenly different. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how many years I'd spent trying to earn love that should have been freely given. Thinking about the woman I used to be before I learned how to shrink. My withdrawal wasn't passive. It was a boundary. It was me saying without words that I would no longer be the only one keeping this marriage alive. If Nathan wanted us, he would have to show up. Not perform. Not gesture. Show up. Deep down, though, I already knew the truth. Nathan had never fought for anything in his life. He coasted on charm. On other people's effort. On the assumption that things would continue simply because they always had. And I was tired of being the path he walked on without noticing. It took him nearly 3 months to finally ask me directly what was happening. We were sitting in the living room on a Sunday evening. The TV was on, volume low, some show neither of us was really watching. He muted it and turned toward me, his face tight with frustration and confusion. "Lena," he said, "what's going on with you? You've been distant. Is there something you want to talk about?" I studied his face for a long moment. This was the conversation I'd been waiting for. The opening I once would have grabbed with both hands. But instead of relief, I felt something like sadness. Because he wasn't asking out of concern for me. He was asking because my change had disrupted his comfort. "I've been thinking," I said carefully. "About us." His brow furrowed. "About what? Do you remember what you said to me on our anniversary?" He shifted in his seat. "Not exactly. You told me to stop trying to be romantic because it was embarrassing. You said I was pathetic." He winced. Something like guilt flickered across his face, but it passed quickly. "I was having a bad day," he said. "You know I didn't mean it like that." "How did you mean it?" I asked. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just meant you don't have to try so hard. We're married. We don't need all that stuff. Anymore." There it was. The gap between us, finally exposed. To him, love was something you did at the beginning, a phase that ended once commitment was secured. Romance was optional. Emotional effort was excessive. To me, love was the maintenance. The showing up. The choosing each other again and again. When did showing love become unnecessary? I asked. When did caring about each other become embarrassing? That's not what I'm saying, he snapped. Then what are you saying? I pressed. Because it sounds like you've been taking my love for granted for years, and the only reason you noticed something was wrong is because I stopped giving it. He opened his mouth, then closed it. For a moment, something like understanding crossed his face. Then the walls went back up. You're blowing this out of proportion, he said. I've always been there for you. I work hard. I come home every night. What more do you want? That was the moment everything clicked. He truly believed that existing near me was enough. That providing financially and occupying the same space fulfilled the requirements of partnership. I want a partner, I said quietly. Someone who wants to know me. Someone who asks questions and listens. Someone who plans things sometimes instead of waiting for me to do all the work. I want to matter to you beyond what I can do for you. You do matter, he insisted, but the words felt rehearsed, hollow. Do I? I asked. Because I can't remember the last time you did something for me just because you wanted to see me happy. I can't remember the last time you asked about my dreams, my fears, my inner world. He stared at me, stunned. And I realized then that he had never once considered our marriage from my perspective. I wasn't a person with needs to him. I was infrastructure. Reliable. Invisible. Taken for granted. What do you want me to do? He asked finally, fear slipping into his voice. And that's when I knew. Even now, even here, he didn't want to understand. He just wanted instructions. And love doesn't work like that. The weeks after that conversation felt heavy, like the air itself had thickened. Something had been said out loud that couldn't be stuffed back into silence, and yet nothing truly changed. Nathan seemed shaken, but not transformed. There was no deep reckoning, no curiosity about my inner world, no sustained effort to understand how we had arrived here. Instead, there were gestures. Small, awkward, disconnected gestures that felt less like love and more like someone following instructions they didn't believe in. One evening he brought home flowers, the generic kind from the grocery store, still wrapped in plastic, water already leaking from the bottom. He set them on the counter and said, I got these for you, like he was handing me a receipt. Another night he suggested we go out to dinner, then spent most of the meal scrolling on his phone, occasionally nodding while I talked. He started saying I love you more often, but the words felt flat, like lines read off a cue card. I watched all of this with a strange mix of sadness and clarity. Nathan wasn't trying to reconnect with me. He was trying to reset the system. He wanted things to go back to how they were, back to a version of our marriage where I did the emotional labor and he benefited from the results without having to engage. His attempts weren't about making me feel loved. They were about convincing himself he'd done enough so I would resume my role. And that realization, painful as it was, freed me. Because once you see that someone misses the convenience of your love, not the experience of you, you stop negotiating with yourself. I started seeing our entire relationship differently, like a photograph that shifts once the lighting changes. Moments I'd once treasured now looked different under this new understanding. Our engagement. I'd always remembered it as romantic. Now I could see how little thought he'd put into it, confident I'd say yes no matter how it happened. Our wedding. I'd planned almost everything while he showed up and smiled for pictures. Our years together. Me building a life around his preferences, his comfort, his pace, while my own needs stayed quietly unmet. My sister Brenda came to visit not long after. She took one look at me and knew something had cracked. Over tea at the kitchen table, I told her everything. The anniversary. The album. The silence. The conversation. the hollow attempts at repair. She listened, then said gently, I tried to warn you. You just weren't ready to hear it. I thought I could love him into being different, I said. I thought if I gave enough, he'd eventually give back. She shook her head. You can't love someone into changing. They have to want to do it themselves. And from what you're telling me, he doesn't want change. He wants comfort. She was right. Nathan grew frustrated when his gestures didn't produce the outcome he wanted. When I didn't respond with gratitude and renewed devotion, his tone shifted. He started making comments about how nothing he did was ever good enough. How I was impossible to please. How I was being cold. Slowly, he repositioned himself as the victim. One night, out of nowhere, he accused me of having an affair. The accusation landed like something thrown, sharp and sudden. He demanded to know who I was talking to, why I was always on my phone, what I was hiding. The irony almost took my breath away. He had ignored me for years. And now that I had pulled back, he assumed another man must be responsible. There's no one else, I said, my voice calm in a way that surprised even me. There's just me, finally realizing I'd been alone in this marriage for a long time. He didn't believe me. Or maybe he did and couldn't accept what it meant. Either way, that accusation revealed something essential. Nathan couldn't imagine a world where I chose myself. He couldn't conceive that his behavior might have consequences. In his mind, I was malfunctioning property, not a person who had reached her limit. That was the night I moved into the guest room. At first, he protested. Then he grew quiet. Then he stopped mentioning it altogether. The physical distance mirrored everything else between us. We passed each other in hallways like strangers. Ate meals separately. Lived parallel lives under the same roof. My mother called one evening. Mothers always know. I gave her the shortened version, that Nathan and I were struggling, that I wasn't sure our marriage would survive. She was quiet for a long moment, then said something that settled deep in my chest. I've watched you make yourself smaller for that man for years, she said. Whatever you decide, I want you to know your happiness matters. You deserve someone who makes you feel bigger, not smaller. I cried after we hung up. Not from sadness, but relief. Hearing my mother say that felt like permission. I didn't know I'd been waiting for. The truth I'd been circling finally landed. This marriage wasn't good for me. It hadn't been for a long time. Telling Nathan I wanted a divorce didn't happen in a dramatic explosion. It happened on a quiet Thursday evening. He was on the couch watching television when I walked into the living room and said the words I'd been practicing in my head for weeks. I want a divorce. He laughed. A short, disbelieving sound. You're not serious. I am, I said. I've talked to a lawyer. I'll be staying with Colleen for now. That got his attention. He muted the TV and turned toward me, confusion sliding into panic. You can't just do this, he said. We haven't even really talked. We've been talking for years, I replied. You just weren't listening. This is insane, he said. You're ending our marriage over a photo album? It was never about the album, I said quietly. It was about years of feeling invisible. About being told my feelings were too much. About being made to feel ashamed of how I love. He stood up, hands moving wildly. I've been trying. I brought flowers. I took you to dinner. What else was I supposed to do? You were supposed to care, I said. Not because you were afraid of losing me. But because you wanted to make me happy. He searched his memory for a defense, for proof I was wrong. He didn't find one. I can change, he said finally. Just give me another chance. I gave you 6 years of chances, I said. And you used them to show me my feelings didn't matter. He looked smaller then. Frightened. Desperate. I love you, he said. You love the idea of me, I answered. You love what I do for you. But you don't know me. And I don't think you ever really tried. I picked up the bag I'd already packed. As I walked toward the door, he asked me to wait. I turned back one last time. I hope you learn from this, I said. I hope the next woman doesn't have to beg the way I did. Then I left. And for the first time in years, the weight lifted. The drive to Colleen's house felt unreal, like I was watching myself from a distance. The streets were familiar, the traffic. Lights changing on schedule, the city moving like nothing monumental had just happened. I expected tears. I expected panic. Instead, there was a strange emptiness, the kind you feel after finally setting down something unbearably heavy you didn't realize you'd been carrying for years. Colleen opened the door before I even knocked. She didn't ask questions. She just wrapped her arms around me and held me there, steady and warm, until my body stopped bracing for impact. Later, she made tea, handed me a blanket, and sat beside me in silence like she understood that words would only get in the way. When she finally asked how I felt, I searched for the answer honestly. Free, I said. The word surprised me with how true it felt. The first weeks after leaving Nathan were disorienting. I slept in Colleen's spare room surrounded by furniture that wasn't mine, using borrowed towels and someone else's soap, yet I slept deeper than I had in years. My shoulders slowly dropped from around my ears. The constant vigilance, the habit of monitoring someone else's mood before my own, began to fade. I didn't realize how exhausted I'd been until I wasn't anymore. Nathan called constantly at first. The messages came in waves. Anger. Accusations. How could I do this to him? How could I throw away 6 years? I didn't answer. Then the anger softened into desperation. He missed me. He couldn't sleep. He didn't know how to function without me. Still, I didn't answer. Eventually, the bargaining began. Therapy. Dates. Gifts. Promises layered on promises. I turned off my phone. I hired a lawyer, Patricia, sharp and calm and refreshingly unsentimental. She handled everything. She told me Nathan wasn't contesting anything, that he seemed stunned into compliance. No children. Simple assets. The life we built together could be dismantled far more easily than it had ever been maintained. That realization stayed with me. I found my own apartment about a month later. A small one-bedroom place on the east side of Columbus. Nothing fancy. But it was mine. I spent an entire weekend painting the walls a soft sage green, a color Nathan once said was too feminine. I filled the space with plants, books, art I actually liked. I let the apartment reflect who I was instead of who I'd edited myself into. At work, people noticed the change. My boss commented that I seemed more present. More confident. I hadn't realized how much energy my marriage had been draining until I got it back. Nathan, meanwhile, was unraveling. I heard updates through mutual friends. He let the house fall apart. He ate takeout every night because he didn't know how to cook. He showed up at his brother's place drunk and crying at 2 a.m, saying he'd ruined his life. I felt no triumph hearing this. Just a quiet confirmation. He tried harder then. Flowers delivered to my office every day for a week until I asked the receptionist to refuse them. Long letters filled with realizations and promises. One night he showed up at Colleen's house demanding to see me until she threatened to call the police. The irony was painful. He was doing everything now that I'd begged for years ago. Writing letters. Planning. Performing romance. But it wasn't love. It was panic. Fear of losing his comfort, his structure, his emotional caretaker. And fear doesn't build anything sustainable. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning in late spring. We sat across from each other in a courthouse conference room. Nathan looked older. Hollowed out. When he signed the papers, his hand shook. Outside, he asked if we could talk. We sat on a bench in a small park across the street. He told me he'd started therapy. 3 times a week. He talked about avoidant attachment. About how intimacy scared him. About how he pushed people away before they could get close. "I'm not making excuses," he said. "I just want you to understand." "I'm glad you're getting help," I told him. And I meant it. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. "Is there any chance, someday, after I've worked on myself, that we could try again?" I answered without hesitation. "No." He broke down. Apologized. Cried. Told me he loved me. I told him I believed he was sorry. I also told him sorry didn't undo damage. That even if he changed completely, I would always remember how small he made me feel. I stood up. Wished him well. Walked away. I didn't look back. The months after the divorce felt like learning how to breathe again. I rediscovered parts of myself I didn't realize I'd buried. I took a pottery class. Joined a book club. Went hiking on weekends. Each small choice felt like reclaiming territory I'd lost inch by inch. Colleen threw me a small celebration she called my rebirth. My sister came. My mother sent flowers with a card that said she was proud of me. I didn't date for a long time. I needed to know who I was without molding myself to someone else. Eventually, when I did meet someone new, it felt different. Balanced. Calm. Mutual. Not because he was perfect, but because effort flowed both ways. Nathan, I heard, struggled. Therapy didn't stick. Jobs came and went. Relationships too. Without someone managing his life, things unraveled. I felt no guilt. Walking away didn't destroy romance in my life. It gave it back to me. I still light candles. Still plan surprises. Still love openly. The difference is that now, my love is met, returned, and valued. Most importantly, I learned how to love myself without apology. I look back now at the woman standing in that kitchen holding a photo album, being told her love was embarrassing, and I want to reach back and tell her the truth. She was never too much. She was just loving the wrong person. After the divorce papers were signed and the legal noise faded, life didn't suddenly become perfect. That's not how it worked. There was no movie-style montage where everything snapped into place. What happened instead was quieter, slower, and much more real. There were mornings I woke up in my apartment and forgot, just for a second, that I was alone. My body still expected another presence. I'd reach for my phone instinctively, then stop. Not because I missed Nathan, but because habits take longer to unlearn than pain does. The silence in my new place felt different from the silence in my marriage. This silence didn't judge me. It didn't ask me to perform. It didn't make me feel invisible. It felt neutral, almost gentle, like a pause instead of an absence. I started noticing how much space I had inside my own head. How many thoughts were actually mine. For years, so much of my mental energy had been spent tracking someone else's moods, adjusting my tone, anticipating reactions. Without that constant background noise, my mind felt clearer, sharper, like fog lifting after a long winter. There were still moments of grief. Grief isn't logical. It doesn't care that you made the right decision. It shows up in unexpected ways. A song in a grocery store. A couple laughing at a table near mine. The smell of something familiar. But the grief wasn't for Nathan. It was for the version of me that believed love meant endurance. I mourned the woman who thought being chosen meant staying, no matter the cost. The woman who confused loyalty with self-abandonment. The woman who kept pouring herself into something that never filled back up. Therapy helped. Not because it fixed me, but because it gave me language. It helped me see patterns I'd normalized for years. How I overfunctioned in relationships. How I equated effort with worth. How I learned early on that being useful felt safer than being vulnerable. I learned that I didn't just marry someone emotionally unavailable by accident. I was familiar with that dynamic. I knew how to survive in it. I knew how to make myself smaller to keep peace. That realization didn't shame me. It softened me. Because once you understand why you did something, you can forgive yourself for doing it. Nathan still tried to contact me occasionally. Not as frequently as before, but enough that his name popping up on my phone still made my stomach tighten. The messages changed tone over time. Less frantic. More reflective. Apologies layered with insight. Admissions he'd never made before. I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty. Out of clarity. I wasn't his teacher. I wasn't his reward for growth. I wasn't proof that self-reflection paid off. I was a person who had already paid too high a price. Mutual friends brought updates I didn't ask for. They told me he seemed different. Quieter. More introspective. They told me he talked about me like a lesson he learned too late. I hoped he kept learning. I just didn't want to be part of the curriculum anymore. Slowly, my life filled with things that didn't require permission. I rearranged my furniture just because I felt like it. I stayed out late with friends without explaining myself. I made plans based on my energy, not someone else's expectations. There was a deep, steady confidence growing in me. Not loud. Not performative. Just rooted. I stopped feeling the urge to explain my choices to people who hadn't lived my life. That was new. Dating eventually entered the picture again, not as a goal, but as a possibility. I approached it differently this time. Slower. More observant. Less invested in potential, more attentive to behavior. I noticed red flags I would have ignored before. Emotional distance framed as independence. Dismissiveness disguised as logic. Charm without curiosity. And I walked away from those early. Not dramatically. Just calmly. That was the biggest change. I didn't need closure conversations or explanations anymore. I trusted my internal signals. If something felt familiar in the wrong way, I didn't try to fix it. I stepped back. When I eventually met someone who felt different, it surprised me not because he was extraordinary, but because he was consistent. He followed through. He asked questions and waited for the answers. He noticed when I was quiet and didn't make it about himself. Being with him didn't feel like work. It felt like presence. And that's when it hit me, love was never supposed to feel like performance. It was never supposed to require shrinking. It wasn't meant to be earned through exhaustion. Real love didn't ask me to prove my worth. It assumed it. Sometimes I think about Nathan, not with anger, not even with sadness, but with distance. Like you think about a place you once lived that taught you something important, but no longer fits who you are. He was part of my story. Just not my future. The most surprising part of all of this wasn't that my life improved after the divorce. It was how much lighter everything felt once I stopped negotiating my own needs. I learned that love that arrives only when you're ready to leave isn't love. It's fear. And fear is a terrible foundation for anything meant to last. I didn't leave my marriage because I stopped loving him. I left because I finally started loving myself enough to stop disappearing. And once you learn that, once you experience what it feels like to exist fully in your own life, there's no going back. Because the quiet that comes from choosing yourself doesn't feel lonely. It feels like peace. Time did what it always does when you finally stop fighting it. It settled things. Not by erasing the past, but by putting it in the right place. Months passed. Then a year. The sharp edges of everything softened, not because it stopped mattering, but because it stopped owning me. The story of my marriage became something I could hold without bleeding. I stayed in my little apartment longer than I expected. It became a sanctuary in a way I hadn't planned. I learned my own rhythms again. When I liked quiet. When I wanted noise. When I needed people. When I needed space. I stopped apologizing for any of it. There was a moment one evening, small and ordinary, that told me everything had truly changed. I was cooking dinner for myself, nothing fancy, just something warm and simple. I lit a candle without thinking, not for romance, not for symbolism, just because I liked the way it felt. And suddenly I realized something. I wasn't doing it for anyone else. I wasn't hoping it would be noticed. I wasn't bracing for judgment. I wasn't preparing myself to be told I was too much. I was just living. That realization hit harder than the divorce ever did. Because it meant I was no longer performing my life. I was inhabiting it. Nathan faded into the background of my days. Not in a dramatic way. He just stopped being relevant. I stopped checking for updates. Stopped wondering if he was okay. Stopped feeling responsible for the trajectory of his growth or failure. That chapter closed without ceremony. I heard, eventually, that his life never quite stabilized. That therapy became inconsistent. That jobs came and went. That relationships followed the same pattern, intense beginnings followed by quiet withdrawal. People can only change when they want to, not when they're afraid of consequences. And I finally understood something important. His struggle was never proof that I should have stayed. It was proof that I had been carrying weight that was never meant to be mine. My life, on the other hand, expanded in ways I couldn't have imagined while I was shrinking myself to fit someone else's comfort. My friendships deepened. My work felt meaningful again. My laughter came easier. My body felt lighter, like it wasn't bracing all the time. When love eventually re-entered my life, it didn't arrive with fireworks or grand speeches. It arrived quietly. Consistently. Gently. I didn't feel anxious waiting for replies. I didn't feel the urge to over-explain my emotions. I didn't feel embarrassed for wanting closeness. I felt safe. And that's how I knew it was real. The biggest lesson my marriage taught me wasn't about men or relationships. It was about myself. About how easily love can turn into self-sacrifice when you're afraid of being left. About how dangerous it is to confuse endurance with devotion. I used to believe love meant staying. Now I know love also means leaving when staying requires you to disappear. I think often about that version of me standing in the kitchen, holding a photo album full of memories, being told her love was embarrassing. I don't feel anger toward her. I feel compassion. She was doing the best she could with what she knew at the time. She didn't fail. She learned. And learning sometimes looks like walking away. If there's one truth I carry forward, it's this. Love that asks you to become smaller isn't love. Love that shames your tenderness isn't love. Love that shows up only when it's about to lose you isn't love. Real love doesn't need convincing. It doesn't need managing. It doesn't need silence to survive. And most importantly, it never asks you to betray yourself to keep it alive. I didn't end my marriage because I was weak. I ended it because I finally became strong enough to choose myself.